We're trying to move beyond the idea of architecture purely as static, immobile, form, physical structure to something that's more about the experience of.
We wanted to see whether we could use AI as a way to experiment with creating something closed system, something participatory where the residents take part in creating the data.
The thing with art is that it's just nowhere in the AI conversation.
But the question now is whether are people willing to make that effort to change that.
Hi, Usman and Ling. Welcome to AI Across Borders.
Nice to see you.
Thanks for having us.
So now you've both trained as architects, but your careers seem to have moved away from that. How do you describe what you do today?
Still in the realm of architecture. I mean, not in the physical sense, but I feel like what we have always been exploring in our individual and collective practice is always about just how people make sense of the city, how do they make sense of interaction between each other in the city.
Yeah, for me as well, I feel like every project I've ever worked on, every kind of, even company I've founded has been about exploring and pushing the boundaries of what architecture is. And the area in which we want to contribute, I think, is architecture. And it's just that we're trying to move beyond the idea of architecture purely as static, immobile, form, physical structure to something that's more about the experience of place and space and each other and how we make decisions in space and how those spatial decisions affect us both kind of physically, socially, emotionally, et cetera, et cetera.
It's always great to see all the projects you're doing. And I was looking up this fascinating project called Tree or Three in London. And I want you to first explain to me, and we'll show a video while you're talking about it. What is it about, and how did you come up with the idea?
We were invited to work with a group of residents in a garden in central London, a garden called Clarence Gardens, where there is a plane tree, a London plane tree, which was planted, we think, around 200 years ago. And it's a much loved tree by the community. People call it the story tree. And as we started to work on this project, we realized that everyone had a story or something that happened around the tree. We looked more at the site and at this tree, and we discovered that there were two other trees in the same garden which don't look the same, but they're of the similar scale. And we were told by the arborist that they're most likely genetically identical and linked underground through their root and mycorrhizal network, meaning that the tree that we were calling the story tree was actually, if you like, much broader, much larger than we actually expected it to be. It wasn't just the tree, it was everyone's perception of the tree, the stories of the tree, its siblings, if you like, all the life forms that it supports, its social networks, its root networks, its physical networks. And so that was kind of the turning point.
The turning point, yeah. And we were really inspired by one of the local residents' comment about it, which is that if the tree could talk, what would it say about the world? And I think that was kind of the starting point where we, at that period of time where we started kind of formalizing kind of what it could be, we were really interested in the use of AI. And we wanted to see whether we could use AI as a way to experiment with creating something closed system, something participatory where the residents take part in creating the data, and how that would translate into kind of, I'd say a voice, but it's not really a voice in our perspective, but a way where they can have a conversation with the tree every day. So it's a permanent installation there where residents go about every day passing through it, and they can have conversation when they feel like it, or they can just listen to the tree talking, murmuring, daydreaming by itself at times. So the idea is that this will evolve over time, and that hopefully the idea is that the residents and the people passing through would have a connection to nature through this that is kind of different in a sense.
Yeah, and the project was taking place at a time when we were starting to get deeply critical of what I'll call big tech AI, big business AI, if you like. And while we are interested in the technical and, if you like, the kind of social affordances of these technologies, meaning, we are interested in what they can do and the effect that they have on us. We don't take it as de facto that we have to use some big business's platform. And what's become very clear is you can actually build small models. You can build your own open models. You can actually work, as we did in this case, with residents to create a model that was legitimately their model, that was based on their data, their perspective, their language, their way of speaking, their words. And it was something that, if you like, they're in control of. This project, 3, for all of its other connections to the world, is actually not connected to the internet. It is running, just within its own kind of closed network. And so that was another aspect of this project that we wanted to look at, was how can you build a small AI which can help us make sense of not just each other, but this tree and all of its history, and be able to literally have conversations with it. So what we did is we actually worked with the residents to create the voice, the synthesized voice. So when you go up to the tree and you start to speak with it out loud with your voice, it will talk back, but the voice that you hear will be this kind of melding of the different residents' ways of speaking, their slightly different accents, different genders. It's constantly kind of morphing because the tree is the reflection of how people see it, if you see what I mean. And it's then built on their memories of it. And so you can just have a conversation with it, and it will talk back to you. But it's very much built on the community knowledge of the tree, if that makes sense.
The idea is that you create a mirror where you can see your own reflection of yourself and your relationship to nature. So the idea is that even though it's a voice, but it's really about a mirror to humanity in a sense,
I think,
through this use of kind of this experimental way of looking at AI. But also to say that it's not something that we just started doing now, because for many years, our work has always been about working with citizens to collect data in which they can make sense of the environment themselves. So for this, it's kind of a trajectory, kind of about the kind of work that we wanted to do with AI as well, which is participatory, which is that people have control of the data that they are giving, and that there's a way for AI to kind of make sense of this data, and for the residents to be able to have a sense of kind of responsibility to the work because they contributed the data rather than kind of global data sets that we have.
Yeah, quite often people get excited by this idea of, what does the tree say? But actually, that's for us not the interesting thing. The question is, what do you say to a tree? And that's the sort of amazing thing I think that comes out of this, is that people are starting to sort of ask it all sorts of questions about themselves, about its own history, et cetera, et cetera.
And just one last part about the work is that another part of the aspect was to expose the AI system, the hidden kind of people behind the AI system. So you will notice in the installation that on the side of each of this kind of mound, we have kind of embedded a system diagram that details kind of the people that are behind this kind of AI system. So it's really trying to show people that there's so many things behind it, but also there's so much natural elements around us as well, the pets and the animals that is kind of influencing our thoughts as well. So the idea of biodiversity kind of goes beyond it. It's no longer just man versus nature, but kind of everything comes together. So we shouldn't see things as kind of binary in a sense.
Yeah, we kind of wanted to show that even though this is a very hyper-local project based in a garden, its system diagram necessarily encompasses the whole planet. And so you can kind of track all the way around and back to itself.
I thought it was fascinating because I love the snippet of the kids that were whispering. They would go in the morning and talk to the tree. And I didn't realize it's really not so much about what the tree's saying, but what it's reflecting back, which is so important, because now there's a whole conversation on all of us using these large language models that were built in different countries. And people are saying that we are beginning to speak like them, we're beginning to write like them. It's showing up in research papers. So there's this digital colonialism happening. And in a way, there's no participation. So that is that's where architecture meets AI systems, meets much more than it's kind of representative of a much bigger trend that we're seeing.
That's right. Yeah, and I think for us, what's kind of an interesting question is why? Like, why do we just let it happen that way? And for us in our work, our interest in technology is as, if you like, a kind of almost like a socio-political artifact that we do have the capacity to rescript, reprogram, reimagine, and represent, if you like, in new ways. And that's why we work with technology, trying to work on that, hopefully the cutting edge, to try and define some of this stuff before it gets too concretized in a singular way of kind of interacting with it.
But I think that's where also partly why in our new practice, we kind of also talk about the use of art. So it's not just architecture, but art, because art gives a platform for us to experiment with things, and that people are willing to suspend their disbelief for a little bit of moment to participate in something that might not be seen in their everyday life. This is where I think for us, we think that architecture is lacking in that imaginary element where people are able to reimagine things rather than being fixed by just what the physical fabric tells them to do. And I think with this project itself, because it's kind of, even though it's architectural because it's permanent, but it's set in the context of art, I think people are willing to experiment with this. And again, back to the social-political element, which is that there's so many ways that we can experiment with technology, and you have seen it around, especially in kind of the context of art. But the question now is whether are people willing to make that effort to change that? And I think that's where the problem lies now in the society, where we are kind of made to think that we don't have any ability to change our environment, and kind of like the politics and everything is just holding us down. But we do have that ability. It's just, do we want to make that move?
Yeah, I think the thing with art is that it's just nowhere in the AI conversation. When I did this podcast and I said I want to interview you guys and I want to have other artists, everybody was like, but why? How does that make sense for an AI podcast? I'm like, are you kidding me? This is the most important thing, because we're all stuck in these ways of talking, and I'm no different. Enterprise pilots and ROI and blah 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 blah. But to be truly imaginative, you need somebody to shake you. And it's the same for artists and interactive designers, right? We need to talk to each other more. Like one of the things that I thought was very interesting was how you're really not kind of ostracizing AI, even though you have reservations about the people who are building them and the mega tech firms, but you're really incorporating it into your work. And you started using generative AI in your children's hospital project. Even, I think it had just come out at that time. People are quite scared to do things between children and AI. Can you tell me a little bit about what that project was about and what some of the things you learned were?
We actually started working with the hospital 2 years before, so it's 2022, during COVID period. When we spoke to the hospital, so a little bit of context. So the main entrance is closed for many years because they are going through a major renovation work, which is going to take place for another 10 years. And so they needed another entrance, and they needed a way to show people that this is the new entrance for the hospital. So we were commissioned with that context, that there's an entrance there. They want us to do a work that involves the children in the hospital. But the limit is that because, especially during COVID time, health and safety is a very big thing. But especially for children in the hospital, yeah, it's kind of more important to make sure that they are not infected with other disease. So we spent 2 years working with the hospital teachers. So in the hospital, there's actually a school where the children in the hospital, the patients, go to every day. So we started experimenting with what could it be that we could involve the children, given that there's that limitation that they can't meet in person, they can't gather together to do something together. So we thought, you know what, let's just try Gen AI and see whether is there a way that we can create a collaborative platform.
Well, there was another thing, which was that also the children we were working with ranged in age from 3 years old to 16. And so this is an enormous age range to try and do something collaborative, if you see what I mean. And so we were initially trying to think about, well, how can we kind of work with different children with different abilities, different kind of physical relationship to the world, if you like, different medical needs, different ages, different ways of seeing the world. How can we kind of work with their imagination, if you like? And I think with Gen AI coming on the scene at around that period, we were really intrigued by this idea of how Gen AI, particularly at that moment, almost seemed like a visual representation of a collective unconsciousness, if that makes sense. Because it's, if you remember the sorts of things that people were initially using it for, is like, wild and wacky stuff. And so that's really the starting point for us was, okay, there is a platform out there where you can do this, but what is a collaborative way to do this as a conversation instead of just as prompt image. And so that was the basis at which we started saying, okay, let's get all the kids together. Let's explore the idea of, for each of them, no matter what age they were, what is their idea of life in the world, or growing, or something like a plant or a flower. And we had a whole
something that they have limits in, because they can't actually go out. A lot of times, a lot of the children doesn't have access to the natural kind of environment. So how do they imagine that?
And we had a whole conversation where we'd have workshops with them just on how insane reality actually is. Real fungi and real plants and the amazing forms and colors and structures and things like that.
So I think also bear in mind during that time, well, now I think collectively everyone knows that prompt writing is an art on its own, right? Because back then when it first started, no one really knows how do you interact with the system. So that was something that we learned through this project as well, which is that the idea of it basically is to get them to create a collective, what we call flower bed of plants, imaginary plants that they imagine in their mind. And the way they create it is through prompt writing. So kind of writing out what they think this flower is going to be, or this plant.
Or speaking, and then through an iterative process.
So it could be like some of the kids were thinking about popcorn flowers or demigogon kind of plants. So if you see at the kind of this flower bed in the project, you will find really crazy ideas out there, like sushi flowers, Pomeranian plants, and all these things. So the idea is that can you create kind of a visually coherent flower bed that we can then use as a material to make it into kind of an architectural entrance experience. So you have this kind of flower bed visual that we use to kind of fill up in the lobby and burst out into the facade and onto the street, where the color becomes the floor, the ground color, and it goes up into this urban furniture that's right outside the hospital. And we also wanted to have a way to make it come alive as well, that reacts to the season, because it shouldn't just be a static thing. So on the facade as well, there's kind of embedded media screens where rather than taking just a static image, it's actually reacting to real-time weather data. So it kind of sways when the wind is really high, or when it's snowing, it bursts into avalanche of snow. And so the idea is that you have this kind of passive kind of viewing interaction with it, where over time when you go to the hospital, it seems to be changing all the time.
Yeah. And then the other thing we were trying to do was to mix that that collective unconsciousness, if you like, with real plants, and then with representations of real plants, and then even mirror on the facade where you see the reflection of the plants and trees behind you. And all of this kind of weaves together in a way that you don't necessarily see where the boundary from one to the other is. Are you familiar with this idea of real, real, fake, fake, real, and fake, fake?
I've not heard of that.
If I show you a plant, that's a real plant. If I show you a fake plant, it's a real fake plant. If I show you a fake real plant, it's like a render of a plant. If I show you a fake plant, it's a render of a fake plant. And what we were trying to do was to meld all of these together so that the boundaries between digital and physical, between kind of, between artificial and natural, between, real and unreal are all less obvious. And so this whole stuff basically spills across the facade, across the pavement, and then into the street, where it emerges as real plants that actually
imaginary and impossible.
but that look slightly, that look weird and imaginary.
And for both these projects that you did, the tree and this one at the hospital, what was the reaction of the community?
All of them like it. All of them love it.
It was the first time they did something with no complaints.
With no complaints at all. Because typically, what we heard is that in the hospital, when they install artwork, there's always some complaints from some of the trustee board members and things like that. So there wasn't any complaint, and I think it's partly because it's contributed by children. So it kind of makes it kind of less perceptive in a sense, because it's created by the children. So, I mean, you can't really comment much because it's the effort of the children.
Actually, in the case of the hospital project, we even worked with a nearby school who weren't part of the hospital, but where the kids walk past the hospital just to get to school. We worked with them in a similar way so that they were part of this kind of imaginary kind of creation as well. And when you take people on that journey, on the one hand, there's a bit of a risk, which is that the more people that are involved, the less certain you are about what's going to turn out at the end. Because, it becomes more and more complex dealing with lots of different voices and people and inputs and perspectives. But on the other hand, what we've found, time and time again, is the people who are involved become so invested in it that ideally they actually start to feel like it's theirs. I mean, it is theirs. They, if you like, they own it. They're responsible for it. They have that kind of sense of agency, that sense of accomplishment. So while there is a risk that the kind of the organizer doesn't know what it's going to turn into, they decrease the risk that people are going to complain about what comes out at the other end. They decrease that risk that people are going to be like, why did you waste money? And, and then it kind of gets terminated.
I mean, coming from my world of advising large corporations, one of the biggest topics at Davos right now was that, yes, AI is there. We give it to our employees, and yet no one uses it. Their change management or handling humans and taking them along for the journey it's not working with a top-down approach. They're even struggling with the bottom-up approach. It's almost like there's no scaffolding or some system by which to bring them in. And I feel like what you've done is kind of unlocked this kind of participation and how that is able to make people be more comfortable with that journey. Why do you think people resist all of these corporations and organizations, even cities, which put in these systems, whereas in your projects you feel that there is just more openness, maybe even joy, to be honest, even though they might know about the risks as well?
It's a bit of a cliche to say this, but you know how just because you give everyone a word processor doesn't make them authors. They're not going to suddenly start to write their life work. It takes time for people to understand why they might need or use or be excited by a technology, or in some cases kind of fearing it. I think that's one side of it. But the other side of it, and I legitimately do feel fearful about this myself, which is that increasingly these kind of technology delivery systems, basically platforms, are opaque and inscrutable, and you can't question them, and you are beholden to the decisions that their chief executive might make on behalf of shareholders, all of which means that, yes, there's this platform that's deployed through an organization, supposedly to make people work in a better way, but you have no idea really what you're contributing to, who's made what decision behind the scenes. As we've seen, particularly with big platforms, usually the way it works is kind of to the benefit of those who are delivering the service rather than those who are using it. And even when it is made to be useful and easy to use for people, behind the scenes, what's actually happening is all the data that they're generating is being used by the company to make, to kind of improve it. So for me, I am not surprised at all that there would be skepticism about, widespread, wholehearted adoption. And it's part of the reason why I think that what we're trying to look at is, and where I think there can be excitement is, how do you build your own? And it is a little difficult. It's still difficult to run an LLM on your own laptop, a closed laptop, and it's a little bit slower than you might be used to on something like ChatGPT. But the sense of power, I think, that comes when you know that you're in full control of the system. And particularly when you know that you can give it data, you can give it documents that are very sensitive, and that data is definitely not going anywhere else because it's on a closed system, I think gives you that opportunity to, want to explore more.
But I think what you're saying is also interesting because I think, we've been through the smart city paradigm kind of over the past many years. And one thing that I feel like we learn from this is that there's no one size fit all product out there. And it's really almost ironic that the way AI tools are introduced is that you can have one AI tool that can fit the entire world and that everyone will use it the way they want. So it's kind of almost like wishful idealistic thinking from tech companies' point of view, that they think that they can deploy something which is at the same spec, same way of interaction, the way you interact, assuming that everyone across the globe interacts the same way they do.
Speaks in the same way.
Write the prompt in the same way. I think that's a bit kind of a wistful thing. So I feel like the resistance from kind of the user point of view is quite interesting at this point because it means that there is a wake-up call for technology companies to think about how do we design AI in a way that actually works for individual rather than kind of the collective whole. And that's where I think that the idea
it's not even the collective whole. They're sort of built to work for the average, where nobody is actually average.
Yeah. So there's kind of the assumption that it's average. And I think that's where kind of learning how to use AI for your own use is quite interesting. And funny enough, I think now because of the use of AI as well, you can be a coder, you can be a software developer yourself easily.
Yeah.
So people can do this themselves. They can create their closed system AI.
And you can now, and perhaps ChatGPT could help you do the installation, but you can easily download onto your own machine, cross-platform, a way to run an LLM, and you can choose LLMs just like you might choose wine for the different flavors, textures, et cetera, and then run it locally. And it's actually easy for somebody who's non-technical to do that. A little bit harder to configure and do sort of deeper stuff, but you can do that without being technical.
I mean, now with Claude, Cowork, and these others coming out, they can literally just do a lot of the configuration as well with these agentic systems, which also increases the attack surface and risk surface of everything. But what kind of qualifications, or if there's a young architect listening, right, in Kuala Lumpur or in Lahore, what should they be studying in order to be this kind of future forward architect, artist? Do they need to know how to use AI systems? Obviously, to be creative, you also have to have some theory, you have to have some exposure to how other people thought about it. How should we change the curriculum?
The most important skill is to bring something to life in the real world. And whether that's technological or whether that's just a brick wall or whether that's like, even just a short-term performance in a space, when you take that step to go from the screen or piece of paper or whatever, the theoretical, to the actual, there's so much that you learn about the unpredictability of the world. And most importantly, I think also the serendipity of the world, that, so often designers have sort of these ideas of things that they can do. When they try and put it into the world, if they simply try and translate what was in their imagination to what's what's in the actual world, it never matches. And if you get frustrated by that, then you're not taking full advantage of everything the world is telling you. Because when you start to put stuff into the world and all this unexpected stuff happens and things that you actually wish wouldn't happen, but turn out actually to be something that takes a project in a different direction simply because you tried to build it, the skill of managing that unexpectedness and that uncertainty and being comfortable with changes of plans and and the differences of opinion and and if you like failure, that is, I think, the most important skill of all. Everything else then just becomes a sort of personal preference, whether you're more software minded versus hardware, or whether you're more about bricks and mortar or interactive environments or what have you. But having that sense of like, okay, no, this is for the real world. This is not just speculative.
I think there's a lot of problem in the educational sector now, right? Especially with the use of AI tools, in which that teachers don't know how to teach anymore, in the sense using that tool, and children or students don't know how to do not know how to learn anymore. I mean, they don't know what is the framework to learning. If you want to learn, if you want to make a piece of furniture or you want to appreciate it, you need to learn how to make it. And it's almost kind of against the AI paradigm, which is that it makes it easy for you to give you an answer. If you ask something, it gives you an answer. I think that students, the young architects especially, I think they need to learn how to search for their answer rather than getting someone to tell them the answer immediately. I think it's the search that really makes us understand AI better.
Actually, you reminded me, James Bridle, who's an artist and also author of Ways of Being, has this interesting project, speaking of furniture, where the idea is to collaborate with different AI platforms to create a chair. You know, ChatGPT versus Claude versus Gemini. And through these workshops, you use the AI platform to help you build the chair and instruct you. And in almost pretty much all cases, it results in something that you can't sit on because it collapses. But they are each very different chairs that come out, if you see what I mean. And I think it's a really interesting process to go through. Again, this idea of trying to put something into the physical world to see how the translation from the imagination to the real is not just a smooth path. And actually one should embrace and enjoy the friction of that path.
You know what I love about what both of you said is that this could be taught in a classroom. It won't take a year to do this because we tend to tell kids, don't be passive, don't do this. But the moment they start using their hands and building and searching, like as you're saying, now they're actively trying to work with the AI, trying to build something. Now they're getting all the lessons. The biggest issue at the moment, and it's the same when you try to convince corporate adults who are in a corporate world, you're telling them things. I mean, lecturing nonstop, and it doesn't work. People, I think, resist because they cannot feel it. And so then I recommend, I'm like, go and play with, the AI. But I even feel that's a shortcoming. And I know you guys don't want to do much in the corporate world, but I would highly recommend it because we really need this kind of thinking, this infusion of artists and filmmakers and storytellers to help us navigate this, and in governments as well. I think that's very important. Like, for example, your low, carbon banquet. I just thought that was so interesting. And so, everybody's talking about climate change. Tell the audience about that, and then we'll kind of deep dive into your thinking and why you thought of doing it this way.
So it's a project that I've spent kind of almost 3-4 years developing over time. So the project is actually called Low Carbon Chinatown, and it's kind of started in the Chinatown context in London, where, because I'm an immigrant living in UK and seen as the minority, so I was always interested in just how do we minority community make sense of climate change and what are the kind of native ways that we have been doing in our everyday life to tackle it that people don't know about. So it kind of started from there, and food became something that I kind of use as a way to bind the concept, just because during COVID time, people love cooking. Everyone is talking about ways to cook your food. And I thought that actually that's an interesting way to intersect climate messages in just how do we make our food low in carbon footprint. So it kind of started from there. I started working with scientists, climate scientists, to develop ways that we can make sense of the carbon footprint data of food processes, from kind of how it's being farmed all the way to how it's being processed, how do you source for ingredient yourself, and how do you make the food yourself. And
the transportation.
And the transportation. So it's kind of looking through the entire full life cycle of kind of food system itself, and kind of giving the information back to people to see how they can make sense of it and actually use those resources as a way to cut down their carbon footprint cooking at home, and also kind of looking at not just home, but businesses and restaurants as well eventually. And then I started developing kind of low carbon banquets taking place in like Chinatown, in kind of institution galleries. And this latest one was in Hackney with the Borough of Hackney, with the Hackney Council partnership. And the idea is to kind of expand this out to not look just only on food system, but the wider climate actions. Just what can us ordinary citizens do to tackle the climate change, but also how do we have conversation with each other about climate change issues. And so the banquet is kind of surrounding this idea where it's part of a kind of exhibition context where there's 100 cardboard stools that we've used to display the information for 6 weeks. And then at the banquet, they harvest the cardboard stool and they set on it. Each of the cardboard stool has the climate actions that we develop with climate scientists and economists and also residents there. And the idea is that you embody the action and you speak for it. And so the action kind of ranges from, really small things like changing LED lights at home or to kind of advocating for non-violence. So things that it seems vague, but it's all connected to kind of reducing carbon footprint. And people have conversation. What was really interesting was the conversation became quite heated at times because there's disagreement. For example, vegan versus kind of carnivore. Like, why is it that I have to give up my meat? Like the vegans kind of advocating for kind of ethical kind of sustainability context. So there's a lot of differences. But I think what was interesting was we are able to have a conversation together to discuss all these things. And again, I think it's back to the idea, the similar to what we've been doing with AI as well, is that there's so many choices around and that as a person, you can take all these routes. The question is whether do you feel like you have the ability to make that jump? And I think that's what kind of, especially here, I think in the West, we are kind of feeling the sense of powerless ever so more this year, especially. The idea that we can't really do anything much to change anything. And I think that's what the project wanted to do, is that there's so many options out there. You can make that choice. Whether you want it is really to you as a person. How do you want to do it? So kind of, that's kind of the essence of that banquet.
I love that idea, by the way. And across all of both your projects, you're using data, you're using AI, you're using electronics or design, but there's always the element of citizen interaction and feedback. Is it possible to scale this, or does it always have to be at a small level? If you wanted to give another model for a smart city, the way it's traditionally understood, and you said, no, do it this way, is that even possible practically?
Well, first of all, I would tweak what you said a little bit, which is that actually all the projects are not just about using data, using AI. It's about making data, making AI, making stuff. And again, the way that we try and get people involved is have them make it. The data itself is almost less important. It's the act of deciding what to measure, how to measure, where to measure, when to measure. That's the kind of important aspect, if you see what I mean. Because all too often we think of data as something neutral that we can then just observe and make analysis of. But obviously, all data has arisen because somebody somewhere said, this is important to measure in this way, using this equipment at this time, and also a decision not to measure something else. And so I think, bringing it back to the question of the smart city, both of us used to work a lot, I would say, on larger platform initiatives, looking at this kind of stuff, whether it was on air quality or IoT. It just so happens, I think, that right now we've kind of scaled it down because we're really interested in the hyper-local effects and consequences and stuff. But that doesn't mean, I don't think, that it can't scale back up. Because ultimately, the thing we're proposing is simply the difference between centralizing power and platforms and decision-making or distributing it. And if you can distribute it, if you can distribute how things are done, how people make decisions, how they make decisions specifically about their own lives, and that is both a technical framework as well as potentially kind of a social framework, then that is certainly scalable. And I would argue, actually, it's the only way to scale to the level that actually we need in the 21st century to deal with the whole host of issues that we're
But
now
also
seeing.
questioning the idea of scalability, because I think in this current context, scalability means profit-driven, that companies get profit out from it. And I think that that's something that we want to question again. I mean, it could be an idealistic thing, but I think that there is something there about giving time to kind of to changes, and that the kind of hyper-local intervention that we're trying to prove is that if we give a little more time collectively, we could make more meaningful changes to the environment rather than waiting for a product that is given top down to make that change in, say, 10 years time, just because there's resistance and that there's kind of resistance, and then comes this kind of top down kind of implementation that forces people to change. Whereas what we're trying to do is that, look, if you do it now, if you spend a little bit more time yourself to make the change, you could see the effect immediately.
Yeah.
Because your mindset has changed because of that.
I was going to say, one of the projects that we worked on, we've worked on quite a few different things to do with air quality over the years. And one of the ones we worked on, we essentially compared different ways of working on air quality with communities. Now, there is a kind of, if you like, a typical way that a local authority might want to work on air quality issues, which is to tell the community, here's what you can do to improve air quality. Here's some data, and here's a map of the air quality. Here's a pollution map, for example. And then there was another way that we wanted to explore, which was more about, okay, let's enable people to decide what to do themselves, to measure how and where and when they wanted to. But most importantly, we connected them together in kind of basically in chat groups, in groups of about 6 to 8. So one group kind of had, information sent out and data about air quality. The other one was, you're kind of on your own, but you can talk to each other. And what we showed was that platform, that system, had twice as much impact per pound spent as the previous one. Because you essentially just let people talk to each other, share strategies, try and make sense collectively, rather than a top-down, information-driven thing. And so that sort of thing, again, it is about the hyperlocal, but that is much more scalable than trying to do a bigger and bigger centralized information dispersion.
And the interesting thing is there's this whole Gen Z movement where they want to get offline and meet in small groups in the real world. They even looking for matchmakers now because they don't want to do the Tinder and everything else. But it kind of mirrors the same thing. And yet, as somebody who works on large systems, I'm always thinking, it's good to have humans, but they're bad actors amongst the humans too. How do you account for that when there's so much risk with AI becoming manipulative, it being poisoned, even in the hyperlocal, let alone like a million hyperlocals, it still needs some governance.
We actually had to think about that in the air quality project because one of our concerns was, what if there is a so-called bad actor within one of those groups? Now, we were actually drawing on research centered on a decent sized group where chances are there are enough voices of reason, if you like, to deal with the bad actors without it potentially percolating and spreading much further. I think you're pretty familiar with game theory, has a number of different ways of dealing with that. We were just talking about the tit for tat algorithm in Prisoner's Dilemma the other day as a way of, again, dealing with bad actors. So I think there are a number of ways of handling this.
But I also think that the idea of bad kind of sets that kind of duality again, binary kind of element of either is good actor or bad actor. And I think that, just philosophically, humans have both elements in themselves. And it's not so much the bad actor, but it's about people with different goals coming together in a kind of system. And I think that what I feel like might not be working in kind of big AI products and tech products is that the goals are opaque. We don't actually know what the goals are for the people creating it and us using it. Whereas I think
we know what they say they are, but we know those are not the actual goals.
Yeah. So then the question of bad actor comes in where what you are saying is that what if it's a group of people with different goals? How do we make sure that we are still heading towards the same direction? And I think with hyperlocal system, there is a way, because it's smaller in scale, so people are aware of each other's goal and decision. and that we can then collectively either agree to disagree or that we can move in diverse way, but have a common set of binding kind of goal sets in a sense. And I think that's what is missing. That what you were saying about how tech companies not using the tools because they don't encompass the ability for diverse futures and diverse goals to happen.
One of the things that we always say at the beginning of the project is that we're kind of interested in how do you collaborate even without consensus. So the idea of our projects is not let's get everyone to agree on what to do. It's let's get everyone involved so that they can work on the bit that they want to in the way that they want to and have their work reflected in the final, even if they don't fully agree with their neighbor or whoever else is working on it. And so it takes an extra step of designing, of system design, of interaction design to deal with that. And it takes an extra step of organization and governance and the complexity of all of that. But I feel like the results are much more resilient and robust and scalable.
So now we have AI that is itself becoming manipulative in some ways. So even noticing that is important. I mean, you can have the small language model and really try to build your own, but if you have the more sophisticated models. But Ling and Usman, this was a great conversation. I could talk to you guys for hours. I'm a huge fan of what you're doing, and I am so grateful. Thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you so much for having us. Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thanks for the probing questions.